And then I'd like to introduce Jason, who is this month's specialist. And he's got a presentation and some fun information to share with us.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Yeah, we'll get going. Thanks everybody for joining us. Yeah, my name is Jason Remshardt, and I've been the fish biologist here on the Rio Grande National Forest for 7 years. Spent most of my career in the West, so from New Mexico, Canada, doing fish work. I've moved most recently into a more administrative position here on the forest, but I'm still serving as our fish biologist. And so that's my first love, and I've been doing this kind of work my whole career. And so I'm really excited about it and glad everyone could join us. So we'll just jump right in, get my presentation started, and then we'll all right. All right. Can you see that first screen, Anna? Okay. So we'll just get going. So yeah, being a fish biologist and really any specialist on a national forest, I'm the only fish biologist. We have other biologists on the forest, but I'm the only fish biologist on almost 2 million acres. And so, as you can imagine, it's not something I can or could ever do by myself, right? And so, most of the work we do as biologists includes tons of partners. And I've just got a few of them listed here that we've worked with in the last few years. I know some of those partners are on our call today, so that's great. And thanks for everyone that contributes either financially or with volunteer labor or however that happens. So yeah, this is just a short list of the many different partners we work with. So I just want to acknowledge those folks and the different people that work with us. Okay. So yeah, we're here to talk about cutthroat trout, specifically Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout. And so as the name suggests, right, this is a fish that's native to the Rio Grande drainage of Colorado and New Mexico, actually, but it's our only native fish here on the Rio Grande National Forest. And so the cutthroat trout is one of, at least, depending on the genetic report you look at, it's one of at least 14 different subspecies of cutthroat trout. And so, these are genetically distinct subspecies of the same species of cutthroat trout, right? So they're spread out all over the West. The one here in blue at the bottom of the screen is our Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout. We have others here in Colorado. So the red one, if you can see that color, that's the Colorado River Cutthroat Trout. And within that subspecies, there's even some genetically distinct populations of fish. Like there's a specific one on the San Juan National Forest that's a San Juan lineage. The one on the right, the green one, is the greenback cutthroat trout. And so if you live in Colorado, you're probably familiar with these names being thrown around. But the Rio Grande cutthroat trout is the only one that's native to the Rio Grande Basin, the only cutthroat trout anyway, and it's the only native fish found on the Rio Grande National Forest. And so we have, of course, all sorts of other fish species on the forest and other trout, rainbow trout, brook trout, brown trout, and lots of other recreational species that are sought after. But this is our one native fish, and so that's the one I'm going to be focusing on today. And so, there's a lot of things that we do on the forest, and I'm going to try to cover as many of those as I can. But the first one that I want to talk about is just surveying, right? So you want to know where your different populations of fish are. And as I mentioned before, I'm one person, and so that can't be done by myself. And so we have teams of folks that go out and do these surveys, primarily with our state partners, right? So this is Colorado Parks and Wildlife. They're the ones responsible for managing the fish, typically, and what we think of as the forest biologist, we're the ones responsible for managing the habitat. And sometimes those overlap in quite different ways. And so this is one specifically when we want to do surveys on the forest, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife biologists come out and I'll assist them and do surveys. And so when we're doing these surveys, we're looking for, the numbers of fish, the size, the length, the weight of the fish. We'll even take genetic samples. We'll do fish health surveys depending on the condition of the fish. And so we're trying to maintain these different populations of cutthroat trout on the forest and of course within the entire range. On the Rio Grande National Forest itself, we have at least over 40 streams where we have Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout in them, and many, many other lakes that get stocked and managed as sort of recreational or native Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout lakes. And so those are scattered all over the forest. Yeah, I talked about the different stuff we're looking for. You know, we're trying to examine and monitor the health of the populations either through numbers, through health surveys, genetic surveys, and we do this. We try to do at least every population at least once every 5 years. And so, as you can imagine, that takes us a few years to sort of before we can come back around and do and manage or survey the same population again and again because there's so many of them. Oops, sorry. You know, these lakes and streams, a lot of them are pretty easy to get to, but a lot of them aren't. And some of our best fishing lakes are in some of the most remote places on the forest, you can imagine, because they get the least amount of visitation. So we have a program set up where we call it our High Mountain Lakes program. And it's specifically run by the Parks and Wildlife Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and they got some grant funding through one of our other nonprofits a few years ago. And so these projects are specifically looking to monitor these high lakes that are really difficult to get to. And so, you know, we're backpacking into these, we'll spend several days and we're trying to monitor these fish. And so this is one of the lakes up in the Sangre de Cristos. And so if you're familiar with the area and familiar with the forest, you know, almost every one of the drainages in the Sangres on the forest has cutthroat trout in it. And if you can find a lake at the top, it almost always has fish in it. And these are managed as recreational fisheries typically. You know, spawning and hatchery work is of course another thing that is mostly done by Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but these populations of fish, you know, sometimes they'll come into the wild to occasionally capture, you know, wild Rio Grande Cutthroat trout, and then they'll collect those eggs, take them back to one of their state hatcheries and raise them up during the year, and then they'll go back out and stock them. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of stocking can be done by trucks. You know, in a lot of places you can back right up to the stream. But I've got a little video here I thought I'd play. Now, so this video isn't specific to the Rio Grande National Forest and our airplane stocking, but it's done the same way all over the state. And so when they're talking here about, you know, where these hatcheries are and which strains they're using, those aren't the ones that we stock on our forest. In our wilderness areas, when we stock fish, they're always Rio Grande Cutthroat trout. So if you could just think about that when you're playing this video. So this video lasts a couple minutes. I'll go ahead and play it. Hopefully you can hear the sound, and then when we're done, we'll come back.
These fish that we're stocking today are, they come from lake up behind Pikes Peak. There was a wild spawn, so it was a wild spawn. The biologist went up and spawned the fish, brought the eggs down. We brought the eggs down to Mount Chavanaugh Hatchery and eyed them there and raised them up. And they're about 1.25 inches long today. We will be stocking about 70,000 of these from the airplanes today in northern Colorado. It's efficient. We can get a large quantity of fish into high mountain lakes that are basically only accessible by foot or horseback.
We've coordinated with the biologist and the hatchery as to how many fish we need, what lakes need how many fish, and we're kind of the last step in the process after they get done growing them. We try to do it early in the morning when the lakes are the calmest, plan the approach, and then just do the approach into the lake, get about 100 feet over the lake, 150, and slow it down to about 80 knots, 75, and drop the fish. We'll go towards the outlet, so we're always exiting towards the lowest point of the lake. They're so small that they don't have a lot of mass to them, so their acceleration rate's pretty low. They stop pretty quickly as they go out of the plane. So our cue is once the strut passes the edge of the lake, we can dump, depending on what the winds are doing. Then their heads are kind of the heaviest part, so they tend to go head first and just drop straight into the water. And the idea is to be slow enough that the water somewhat stays with them, and also that they don't dry out on the way down. So that's why we're dropping them low and as slow as possible. I've been doing it about 18 years. It's still fun. It's still one of the favorite parts of my job.
Okay. Yeah, so that's the high lake stocking. And again, it's done by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. We typically do those every other year. We have a series of lakes that we do one year, and we'll do another series of lakes in the other wilderness every other year. But I've never actually been up on one of the plains, but it's pretty exciting. There we go. Talked about fish stocking, talked about surveying. One of the other things we do, and this is how we sort of get at the conservation part of the Rio Grande Cutthroat trout management, is population management. And so these are sort of like the most intensive, most expensive types of projects we do. And this is where we're looking to either reintroduce a population into a stream segment or reclaim it. So maybe there's some non-native trout in there, and it involves removing the non-native trout and going back in with what we want to call our Rio Grande Cutthroat trout and sort of create or recreate one of these streams. I've got several pictures here of one of these efforts. You know, they're pretty intensive. Like I said, we've done, in the 7 years I've been here on the forest, we've done one of these on the forest. Now, there's of course other populations of cutthroat trout in the valley, and there's some on the Great Sand Dunes National Park. And so we've working with the partners there in Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the Park Service. They've been working on one over there in Sand Creek. But we did one up on the Rio Grande National Forest itself back in 2016 and 2017. And we've got some research ongoing and trying to look at other places where we can put fish back in. But it's just, yeah, so the picture on the top left is a picture of the dye that we use. It's not the chemical or anything, but the dye helps us to estimate the travel time or the velocity and the speed of the water. So when we do use the chemical to do the treatments, which removes the brook trout or the non-native trout, you can sort of get a good estimate of the amount of chemical that you need. The picture on the top right there is like trying to get some of these, a lot of this work that we do is in the wilderness. And so this was a contraption that the mule skinner used to sort of help us get some of the stuff into the wilderness, because we didn't have access to horseback at the time, and we couldn't of course use wheeled or mechanized vehicles. And so I took some pictures of that. But the bottom two are, I talked about the one up in Sand Creek that Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve are working on. And so that's one that's ongoing right now. They're reclaiming a couple of high mountain lakes, the lower Sand Creek Lake and upper Sand Creek Lake, if you're familiar with the area. And they're working right now on reclaiming the actual Sand Creek as it flows down into the valley. So those are some of the, whoops. Those are some of the reclamation projects we're working on. You know, we're working with some of our partners with Trout Unlimited to help us identify new places that we can do this work. So that involves, you know, temperature monitoring, some habitat work. And so trying to identify where these next projects are going to go, because they take a lot of planning. So yeah, we've talked about surveying, we've talked about fish stocking, we've talked about restoration. And so the last thing I want to spend time on, and probably we'll spend the most time on talking about this, is habitat restoration. And so at the beginning, I talked about, as a biologist on the National Forest or in forest units in general, you know, typically we're the ones responsible for managing the habitat and not so much the species themselves. And so what I'm able to do is do habitat restoration work, whether it's, working with our hydrologists to improve wetland habitat or, reduce erosion. And one of the biggest projects that we're working on now that we're spending a lot of effort and time on is doing what you call these in-stream projects, where we're trying to simulate the work that beavers do. And so I've got quite a few slides. We'll go through some of these. So I want to talk about beavers specifically. So, the folks that know me and know the work that I do, like I'm really passionate about this beaver work that we do, because they're really awesome. They do this work for us. They're sort of like nature's engineers, right? They're super efficient and they're cheap. And so sort of letting the beavers do their work is sort of the best way to go about it. And, but of course, a lot of instances, beavers, in a lot of places, they don't always work. In a lot of places, they can cause harm, and, they're considered nuisance species, and they have been for most of the last century. If you've got trees in your backyard and you've got beavers, you don't necessarily want them. If you've got roads and culverts, like a beaver just sees a culvert as like a dam that's 90% complete, and it's easy to block up a culvert, right? And so we're always fighting with culverts and roads. And there's a picture there on the bottom right where we've tried to install something what we call like a beaver deceiver, where you're trying to like trick the beavers, and then they always figure it out. It's always a maintenance issue. But so there's a lot of times when beavers and using live beavers doesn't work. And so what we do is try to simulate that work in a lot of places, and where we can, we'll let the beavers do the work themselves as well. But when we talk about beavers, and the work we're trying to do, right? It's all sorts of stuff. It's fish habitat, and I'm the fish biologist, and so that's how I first got into it, right? They create cool water habitats. They sort of create this mixing zone between the groundwater and the surface water, and it actually can cool the water. It can create wetland habitat for all sorts of other species, not just fish, and but birds and other wildlife. It create lots of wet meadow habitat for grazing animals, including our, elk and deer, and of course cows and stuff too. So it creates benefits for all sorts of animals and the habitat and sedimentation. And so I've got this little video that a colleague that does a lot of work with beavers, and folks that are around that know beavers she's like Emily Fairfax, Dr. Fairfax. She's like one of the sort of the forefront of this stuff. So I've got this little video she made that talks about the benefits of beavers and wildfire. So I thought I'd just play this. So just watch for a second. Anyway, I love that little video. So the gist of it is that, this was basically part of her PhD work that she did throughout the West, including Colorado. And what she was trying to prove, and what she did prove, was that, beavers help create these wetland habitats. And as you can imagine, if you've got a single threaded channel that now becomes, that's 5 meters wide, and now it's like 300 meters wide, and it's all wet, like that's a very good fire break. And so, especially here in the West, where we're, wildfires and sort of these large wildfires that are destructive are a big part of our concerns every summer. Beavers can help us mitigate that and even prevent wildfires from spreading, and they create these sort of refugia habitats for all sorts of wildlife, and can also create these fire breaks. And so I just sort of love that. It's really simple, but it works. And so, whoops. I talked about beavers. In a lot of places, they don't necessarily work. And what a lot of the work that we're doing on the forest involves beavers, but it also involves sort of trying to imitate or create habitats that the beavers would do on their own, right? And so, as you can see, this is a spot where it doesn't really necessarily look like great beaver habitat. And so what we're doing is building these things we call beaver dam analogs. There's different names for them. Some people call them temporary wood grade structures, PALs, post-assisted log structures. But these beaver dam analogs do the same work and create beaver dams. Of course, we're not as good at building them, and it takes more work and more manpower than the beavers can do. But so we're just installing these posts, and we'll go through and weave a bunch of willows in between. So it's trying to imitate what the beaver dam is doing, and it's trying to back up water. Sorry. So I've got some pictures of some of these structures we've been building with partners from the Rio Grande Headwaters Restoration Group. And so, you know, we're cutting some local material, putting it in the structures, and it sort of creates these, here's one that was just recently created. On the left there, it shows like, as you know, already see the water backing up, right? So this is like instantly after we built the thing. And so we started this summer, we built 10 of these on the forest. People are doing this all around the West with great success. And again, it's, you know, it's pretty simple as long as you got some manpower, right? There's not a lot of materials to buy. You know, if they last for a few years, that's great. If the beavers take them over, that's great. If they disappear, then, you know, you haven't lost that much because you just lost like a half a day's work. But here's a picture on the right. This is sort of like an actual beaver dam or what it might look like once they're finished. So that's what we're trying to create. And so, yeah, so we talked about the beaver dam analogs. And of course, another way we do that is we'll just move actual beavers. I showed some pictures earlier where we have on the forest, we even have nuisance beavers, right? Because we have, and we try to work around them. We'll build these things called beaver deceivers where we're trying to let the beavers stay. But there's some instances where they just can't, you know, we have to move them, right? And so they're either in some parking lot or it's in some campground where it's just not working. And so we have places identified, and we're trying to identify more where we move these beavers. And so working again with partners like Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado, and again with these folks from the Rio Grande Restoration Group, we're moving beavers across the forest into places where they've historically been, and we'll get into a little bit about that next. But yeah, it's been very successful. We've been doing this since about 2017. We really sort of started ramping it up a couple of years ago in 2019, and up until this point, we've only moved about, I think, 20 beavers at this point across the forest. But we've got, you know, we've got partners working with the USDA group called APHIS, which are, you know, typically like the federal trappers. And as you can imagine, they get calls all the time, either from private landowners or some of the refuges in the valley. And if you can imagine all the water infrastructure and canals and irrigation structures in the valley that are out there, that beavers are a problem all over the valley. And so we're ready to take them, and we have places all over the forest to take them. Plenty of places that we can put them. So we're doing that as well. You know, because as I mentioned, beavers doing their own work are the best, and you know, they're the best at doing their own work. And this is just this is one of the beaver dams. I've had several pictures of it over the years, but this is one up above Rio Grande Reservoir. I mean, this pond itself is probably 20 or 30 acres, and it, you know, provides, you know, this day I took this picture, I actually saw a moose in there as well. So like, it creates all sorts of habitat, not just fish habitat. And so I talked about, yeah, moving the beavers, right? And so what we're trying to do when we're doing that was we're trying to identify places. We need to know where we can put them. And so one of the other things I'm trying to do is identify where beavers are or aren't on the forest. And so I've got a pretty good idea of where beavers should be. We use this thing called a beaver model, and it's a pretty simple thing. It just basically takes GIS layers. So it takes overhead images of the riparian habitat, and then we overlay that with like slope, and we overlay that with a water layer, and this sort of gives us a good idea of where beavers can or can't be. And then this is where the folks like you guys come in, right? So we have this thing called iNaturalist, and anyone can download this. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it, but it's just an app you can identify all sorts of animals, right? And no matter where you are, you can take a picture of a tree or an insect or a mammal or a bird and throw it up on iNaturalist, and the community will help you identify it. And there's even some picture identification stuff that will try to identify stuff for you. And so we created with our volunteer program a project within iNaturalist that will take any beaver or potential beaver sighting on the forest and then throw it into this project. And then I get a download once a week that tells me like all the different beaver sightings on the forest. And so I wanted to spend some time to go through this because, you know, the more people we have out there, the easier it is to collect data and the more data I can get. So I thought I'd spend a little time going through our iNaturalist program. And so a lot of these slides came from a project where we had a specific group of folks going out doing surveys for us, but I wanted to spend, yeah, some time on the beavers. And so if you're familiar, like I said, if you're familiar with iNaturalist, it all makes sense, but you don't necessarily have to take a picture of a beaver. It's great. If you see one, like that's an easy one, right? But there's lots of things that you can take pictures of and say, hey, I think this might have been there might be beavers living here. It might be something like a dam, which are pretty obvious, right? At least a lot of times they're pretty obvious, especially if you see like fresh chews. You know, there's a lot of times you'll see dams that there might not be any active beavers on there, but if the dam is still there, serving its purpose, then that provides us some information too. A lodge, of course, right? These are pretty obvious. And of course, if you see freshly chewed trees, that's an easy one. The one on the right is an older one. This still tells you that, hey, maybe this is a spot where beavers were in the past, and maybe we can put them back again. So tracks even, right? You can take a picture of some beaver tracks. We use this a lot for other species like our Canada lynx. We use track surveys and people identify tracks a lot of times in the snow, and we'll throw that into iNaturalist. So tracks are always a good way for something like beavers. Scat, of course. And then it could be something as simple as like, well, I don't know that there's beavers here, but I see some other stuff that looks like good beaver habitat. And so this would be like if you've identified either a picture or a dam, you could throw some other pictures or put it in the notes and say, hey, you know, I see aspens. These are just some of the trees that are like, you know, the food of the beaver, right? Aspens, willows, alders. These are sort of their most favorite tree types. And so it's always good to sort of look around and being able to identify these different trees as well. So yeah, just some tips on iNaturalist. Again, if you've used it, you know how it works. But yeah, you can take all sorts of pictures. You know, you don't necessarily have to have the iNaturalist open when you're out in the field. You know, I've done it before. I just take pictures when I'm out, and then when I get back, then you also have to like figure out where you were, of course. But you can do all the iNaturalist stuff back at your house when you have time to throw in a bunch of pictures. But yeah, I wanted to throw this up because it's a great tool. I use it for everything, not just mammals and beavers, but it's a great app to help you sort of become a better naturalist, right? So I talked a little bit about what the data is for. So this is like a picture of my GIS layer where I take this beaver information and I throw it into these maps. So I've got layers that say, hey, here's some beaver sightings across the forest. And so this helps us, like I said, identify places where we can look and say, well, either this place could have beavers and they don't, or you know, there's beavers there and they're doing great. So it sort of helps us track the progress across the forest. And so that's the benefit of that data. Yeah, I spent some time talking about all the different types of habitat work we do, the survey work, you know, the beaver work. There's, like I said, there's lots of people doing this work. And so I'm not starting from scratch, right? There's people that have written books on beavers. There's people, you know, these restoration guidebooks, and there's lots of different methods out there for transplanting and building these beaver dam analogs. And so it's stuff that there's tons of information out there. And so it's been really helpful for me to sort of learn the process and hopefully build better restoration projects for fish and for beavers. So yeah, I think that's it for now. Stop the presentation and then yeah, if folks have questions, happy to try to answer them. And we'll go from there.
Are you seeding any cutthroats in Mineral County?
Mineral County, yeah. So there are several recreation. We don't have any like our core genetic populations of cutthroat trout out there that we manage, but there's tons of recreational populations up in Mineral County in the upper part of the Rio Grande itself.
Wiley Lakes used to have cutthroats in it, and I think they removed them all because they were going down into 4UR Ranches lakes in whatever. So they were all flushed out somehow or another of Wiley Lakes, which a lot of people liked and used up there. It was good for kids and older people in these 3 or 4 small lakes in a row that are up on up in there. So there's no plans to do anything to Wiley Lakes or anything in Crete at this time, huh?
Well, I do know that one because it was part of the, so I didn't mention the name of it, but the restoration that we did on the forest starting in 2016 and completing in 2017 was what we call the Roaring Fork River. And so if you're familiar with that, the Wiley Lakes are part of that drainage. And so that all was treated and all the fish were removed, but we went back in and stocked the creek and the lake itself. I mean, the Roaring Fork itself. I don't think Colorado Parks and Wildlife has stocked the lakes, but it's something they're definitely looking into because we know that those lakes, even if they don't have beavers anymore, they're old beaver dams, that they held fish, of course, in the past. And so it's definitely something we're looking into. And if we either have to, build up those lakes back ourselves, or maybe just put beavers back in there so they can build the dams back up. But yeah, those Wiley Lakes were part of that Roaring Fork restoration. So
that's part of Roaring Fork, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're just higher up in that system. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that was good. There was a lot of people really enjoyed fishing up there. It was easy fishing and easy to walk in. Wasn't too long a hike in to get there and all. And,
yeah.
That'd be nice if something happened back in there. I've got a really good 80-year-old friend that used to take his grandkids and great grandkids up there all the time, and he's really disappointed. And I tried to get a hold of him to get him on this video today with you all, and couldn't get a hold of him. So will this be video he can access later on?
Yes, we'll have this recorded and on the San Juan Mountains Association's YouTube, as well as the forest website with a link. You can always I'll put my email in the chat, and you can always send me an email if you're looking for a specific link, and I can get that to you.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's good. Thanks for the reminder.
Yeah,
I didn't mention the Roaring Fork specifically, but.
Let's see, we got a question in the chat. Do you have any updates on the Jim Creek restoration project from Cody?
So Jim Creek, there's parts of Jim Creek. So Jim Creek and Torcito Creek are 2 of our Rio Grande Cutthroat populations that start on the forest. So if you're familiar with that area, it's near Lahar Reservoir. And I assume that's the one he's talking about. And most of that work that I know Trout Unlimited and the local chapter has done has been on the state land. And so I know it's a project they're working on every year. They've done some actual stream restoration in there. And so you'd have to probably get with the Trout Unlimited folks to get a current update, but I know it's a project they're working on every year, and they have a project where they try to do brook trout competition. So whoever can remove the most brook trout in a year can win a prize, right, from Jim Creek. It's something that they're definitely working on, and it's one of the key projects for the Trout Unlimited group for the local chapter. So. Yeah.
And we have a question from Owen Woods from the AlamosaCitizen.com. and he is asking, does the valley have a healthy beaver population? And is there any concern for the species at all in regards to overpopulation or underpopulation?
Yeah, I mean, relatively speaking, I think we have a really good beaver population across the forest and in the valley. We probably have more problem beavers and nuisance beavers, however you want to call them, than we have places to put them right now. And so, we do have some work to do. There are places where we think we can put beavers back onto the landscape where they historically were, where they're not currently. But I think we're doing really well, and it's one of our forest plan monitoring goals is to get more beavers on the landscape, or at least put them in places where it makes sense, right? The closeness to infrastructure, so we don't want to be doing places where it's causing problems. But we have plenty of places that are in the backcountry on the forest where we can move lots of beavers. But yeah, if you spend any time on the forest, you can find them all over the place. So relatively speaking, I think we're doing pretty well. Does that answer your question? I think I got it all, but yeah. Okay, cool. Awesome.
Then we have another question from Luke. Any idea on the mortality from dropping fish from the airplanes?
Yeah, I know it works. I couldn't tell you like what the survival rate is on a plane drop, but I mean, I know the aerial fish stocking works really well. And he talked about a couple things. I mean, right, these are tiny fish, so they don't have a lot of mass, right? So even though you're dropping it from an airplane, I think the survival rate is really high. And so one of the things we wanted to do, that Colorado Parks and Wildlife wanted to do with these high lake surveys, was to verify that these aerial stockings that we're doing every other year into these lakes was taking. And so, we went into all these high mountain lakes over the last several years and tried to do surveys. And where the water quality was great, I mean, there's good fish numbers across all these lakes. Now, there were a few instances where we didn't find any fish, but almost in every one of those circumstances, it was because of water quality. Either the lake itself was too shallow and it got too cold, and so you would get these hard freezes where there just wouldn't be enough water left in the lake to hold fish, or there would be some other water quality issues just because of naturally high levels of pH or something in the lakes. But yeah, the places where the water quality was great, which is like 99% of the time, there's tons of fish in these high mountain lakes. And so I think the survival rate on those drops is pretty good, or at least good enough to make it worthwhile for sure.
I have a question. Can you describe what beaver scat looks like?
Yeah, well, I had a picture of it earlier. If you can imagine the things that beavers like to eat. So I talked about willow and aspen and the different tree species, right? It's gonna look like a lot of chewed up bits of trees. And so and if the guts of a beaver are not very well developed, and so they're eating a lot of hard woody material, and so it's gonna look like that. If you've spent any time in the backcountry and you've seen moose droppings, right? So it's like moose droppings, but probably a little rougher than that. So it's a lot of roughage and a lot of rough material, and not very well digested. So it's gonna be pretty easy to notice, I think. One of the questions we always get for beavers is like, what types of things do they eat? And there was I always like to bring this up. There's an old instance in a book and maybe in a movie where it talks about beavers eating fish. And so that was one of the things that sort of gave beavers a bad name, a long time ago. It was like, well, the beavers are eating all our fish. I was like, well, they're vegetarians. Like, they're eating trees. They're eating sticks. They're definitely not eating fish. And so, yeah, when you're looking for beaver scat, you're just looking for lots of chewed up bits of brush and trees.
Okay, we got a couple more questions. Scott asked, what other species of fish are challenging the native cutthroat.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, Connor had a comment there in the chat. Like, it's going to be hard a lot of times to find beaver scat because they don't like to get out of the water unless they're, they like to spend most of their time in the water, and so that's what they're going to do most of their business. And so to actually find beaver scat might be pretty hard to do. The species that make cutthroat trout management the hardest, well, different ones depending on what you're after. And so the one that we deal with the most is brook trout. And so brook trout and Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout, they compete for the same habitat. They're found in the same stream types. And so brook trout, the thing that makes them really popular is they're really aggressive and they're great to fish for, and they're easy to catch. So that's what makes them really popular. But it also means that they're really aggressive fish. And for whatever reason, if you have brook trout and Rio Grande Cutthroat Trout or any cutthroat trout in a system, eventually you'll end up with nothing but brook trout because they're just way more aggressive. They spawn at different times of the year. And so brook trout, along with brown trout, those are what we call fall spawners. So they're spawning and putting their eggs in the gravel actually this time of year, September, October, early November. So if you've caught any of those fish, in the last month or so, especially brook trout, like they're really colorful this time of year.
Let's go outside and pee. Come on. Let's go, girl.
Cutthroat are spring spawners, and so they don't necessarily interbreed, but you're mostly concerned about competition and aggressiveness of the brook trout. So brook trout's one of our main ones. Rainbow trout, on the other hand, do also spawn in the spring. And so when we're talking about rainbow trout, they're ones that actually interbreed with brook trout. And so you'll end up with these hybrids. You've probably heard, if you fish a lot, you heard of these things called cut bows. So that's when they can do it in the hatchery as well, but you'll get these mixtures of rainbow trout and cutthroat trout. And so they'll spawn and you'll end up with these fish that look somewhere in between. And so you can lose genetic material that way. Any sort of non-native trout is a threat, but brook trout are probably the one that we deal with the most. That's a good question. I don't have the chat up, so I can't necessarily see the questions, but if you got any more?
I think that's all that's come through the chat. If anyone else has any more, feel free to just ask them out or throw them in the chat. While we're waiting to see if anyone else has any more, I can announce that this month's drawing prize winner is Luke. So if you can send me a quick message, Luke, congratulations on your prize, and we'll make sure we get that to you. And thanks all for joining. Let's see. And if anyone has any other questions, you can feel free. I put my email in the chat. You can feel free to shoot me a message and I can pass it along to Jason as well. We can get you those answers.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. And thanks Anna for putting these on. These are great. And yeah, if you have any more questions, send them to Hannah and she can forward them on and we'll try to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you all. We'll be back here next month. We'll be doing a program on winter recreation, some things you can be doing on the forest when it gets all snowy. So I hope you'll join us back here in about a month for the last one of this year. And again, this will be up on YouTube if you'd like to share it around or rewatch again. And thanks all for joining. And thank you again, Jason, for sharing all of this with us.
You're welcome. Thanks.